The night over the Indian Ocean always seems especially thick. Such darkness doesn't just hide the horizon, it seems to erase the very boundary between sky and water. At an altitude where the air is getting thinner and the stars are brighter, a Boeing 747 is moving slowly. South African Flight 295. Helderberg. Everything is quiet inside the cabin for a moment. The autopilot guides the liner on a long route across the ocean. The engines vibrate softly, and only the instrument lights create a soft, even glow. The clock shows the dead of night, 2:45 a.m., Mauritius time. There are only a couple of people in the control room on Earth. They were used to the silence of these hours. Rare flights, short negotiations, routine notes in magazines. The Springbok 295 is due to arrive soon, as the flight controllers call it. Another standard check-in, another short phrase, the usual life of night duty. But when the voice of the crew finally appears on the air, it sounds different. First, the formality, Springbok 295, good morning. But the next fragment knocks the dispatcher out of his usual rhythm. We have a problem, is a phrase that would be better never to encounter. The voice is calm, even almost controlled, but there is something in the pauses, in the breathing, in the tense clarity. This is not an ordinary communication check. Smoke, problem in the airplane, requesting emergency descent. Smoke, at a height, at night, over the ocean. The dispatcher immediately confirms that he is fully prepared for an emergency, moving automatically as he was taught. At such moments, the body works faster than thoughts. The teams are leaving for the terminals. The staff is being roused from their rest. Fire trucks and paramedics are getting ready. Everything must be set up before the plane reaches the coast. But at that moment, the connection is cut off. It was as if the thin wire that connected the huge metal machine in the sky to the small tower on the island had been cut.
The radio goes silent. There is a frighteningly clear silence on the frequency. Springbok 295, do you copy? No response. The dispatcher is waiting. 5 seconds. 10. Half a minute. Again. Springbok 295, do you read? Silence. Glass. Ringing. Full. These minutes become an eternity. In the tower, they are no longer just preparing a strip. They are waiting for a sound. Any sound. Background, noise, scream, whatever. But the ether remains dead. 5 minutes pass. 10. Half an hour. And all this time, the dispatcher repeats over and over again the already meaningless appeal. Springbok 295, respond. Silence responds with unchanging emptiness. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, in an area where even the radar does not work, the plane disappears from the radio, disappears into the night. And no one knows whether it continues its flight, whether the crew is fighting, or nothing can be changed. And a few hours ago, everything started as a regular flight. Taiwan, a terminal illuminated by a cold white light. The South African Boeing 747, known as the Helderberg, is waiting for passengers to board. This is a modification of the Combi, a special type of 747 where the main deck has a passenger front and a cargo rear. They are separated not by a wall, but by a movable partition. The decision, which was supposed to give airlines flexibility, would later become one of the fatal factors. The crew goes through standard procedures. There are no technical problems. All indicators are normal. But there is one thing that no one finds strange at that moment. The captain receives a confidential document to sign. He signs his name, but he does not show its contents to either the co-pilot or the flight engineer. He just puts the paper away and continues working. Passengers, 140 people. The cargo consists of 6 large containers loaded onto the main deck. And at some point, the Taiwanese customs officer decides to make an unscheduled check.
Quickly, without unnecessary interference. He looks at the contents of the containers, checks the notes, and 10 minutes later signs, "Everything is in order." The flight is delayed for about an hour, but finally takes off into the night sky at 22:30. It's gaining altitude. A replacement crew takes control. Passengers are trying to get settled in their seats, preparing themselves for a long flight. Most of them fall asleep. But the route of this plane is unusual. He doesn't take the shortest route. The liner seems to carefully circumnavigate the land, choosing a path that runs completely over the ocean. No overflights of countries, no risks of crossing the airspace closed to the South African airline. In the late 80s, the world treated South Africa with contempt and suspicion. Sanctions, isolation, limitations. Flights have to be laid where there are no obstacles, along lines where there is only water and sky. There are also a couple of strange historical facts that accompany the flight. South Africa, in the late 80s, is waging an armed conflict in Angola. She needs technology, equipment, and weapons parts. And international sanctions do not allow them to be bought openly. Taiwan, which is also in international isolation, maintains ties with South Africa. And in some closed reports, there are hints of cooperation that circumvents sanctions, such as the transportation of sensitive cargo on civilian flights. That is why the station Zur, a key point of HF communication with South Africa, records all the conversations of the crews leading routes over the ocean. Magnetic tapes are the only documentary evidence of what happened in the air. Everything the pilots say about the weather, route, and problems is recorded there. But later it turns out that it is the Zur tapes, recorded on the night of the tragedy, that will disappear. In the meantime, the plane continues to fly. The main crew returns to the cabin. The shift crew, tired after 8 hours over the ocean, gives up their seats. Everything looks routine. The lights of the instruments, the steady hum of the engines, the endless blackness outside the windows. It is at this moment that the captain decides to reveal the secret, to tell about the contents of that very document. Between themselves, without witnesses, he says, "I was told that there was a bomb on board, that the documents were forged, that the cargo is state-owned." The co-pilot and the flight engineer look at him in mute shock. "Who knows?" they ask. "No one," the commander replies. After a short pause, the flight engineer utters a phrase that will appear more than once in the investigation. "We are already dead." And as if to confirm these words, the steward looks into the cabin. "Dinner is ready. What will you have?" Life goes on as usual, as if nothing had happened. The crew eats, checks the indicators, looks at the route. It takes about half an hour. And then, suddenly, without warning, the co-pilot notices smoke near the right wing. At the same moment, there is a dull, heavy bang in the tail section of the aircraft. The cabin is deafened by the howl of alarms. The crew's algorithm of action turns on automatically, but the situation is developing too fast. They see smoke, they can smell it. They hear alarms, but they don't see what exactly is burning. The containers are behind a partition. Visibility is zero. No cameras. Just the appliances and the smell, which is getting denser by the second. In the next few moments, a struggle begins that will last 19 minutes and will become one of the most tragic in the history of ocean flights. Those minutes are still ahead. In the meantime, The dispatcher in Mauritius keeps repeating into the void. Springbok 295, do you copy? The broadcast is silent. And there is more than just an accident over the Indian Ocean that night. There, a mystery is slowly, inevitably unfolding that will survive decades and will never be fully revealed. The smoke in the cabin does not appear immediately. At first, he seemed to be somewhere behind the wall, in the depths of the plane, inaccessible to the eye. But the flight engineer, a person who is used to listening to a car, is the first to notice small failures in the operation of individual systems. Nothing critical, yet. Small indicators that flash on and off, as if doubting whether they should alarm the pilots. But after a few seconds, these doubts disappear. The system begins to lose connection to several circuits at once. A soft, crackling sound can be heard in the cabin, as if someone is scratching on the metal walls. It's a sound that people don't get used to after decades of flying. The pilots exchange glances. The captain's gaze lingers on the flight engineer's panel, where dozens of circuit breakers are located. They're still there, but each of them is a possible signal of impending disaster. His hands are on the steering wheels. He looks at the instruments again, and at that moment a warning flashes into the cabin. A sharp signal about smoke in the cargo deck. No panic, just a short, heavy pause. The captain gives the command to proceed to the emergency procedure. The co-pilot takes out the necessary checklist. The flight engineer switches the power to backup channels. So far, everything is working. This was followed by a second explosion. Quieter than the first one, but deeper, reverberating in the frame of the aircraft. It doesn't seem to come from one place, but from several points at once, as if a fire is making its way along the wiring. The system reports that conditions in the cargo hold have worsened. Sensors detect a strong increase in temperature, but the crew doesn't know how big it is. In the combi design, there is no constant monitoring of the temperature in the cargo area. Only smoke detectors, and the smoke is already there. The captain begins an emergency descent, which he has already managed to transmit to the dispatcher. The height is dropped according to strict procedures to relieve pressure and reduce airflow to the fire. But in theory, such actions should give the crew time. They don't give it today. While the pilots are busy in the cockpit, one of the flight attendants rushes to the back of the passenger area. He knows that there is only one door between the cabin and the cargo hold. Small. It's heavy. Created more to serve than to protect people. In theory, the cabin pressure should be higher. This would cause the smoke to move deeper into the cargo area rather than outward. This is how Boeing originally designed the combi. But now, under the influence of heat, everything works the other way around. When the flight attendant turns the door handle and opens it slightly, a dark stream of air escapes from the crack. Hot, thick, pungent. The colors of burnt wiring and materials are not the colors of smoke. He takes a step back, but does what he has to. Directs the portable fire extinguisher jet inside. It doesn't change much. The fire that is burning somewhere behind the wall is already too strong to be contained by several liters of chemical composition. The door closes. But the effect is already irreversible. The pressure in the cargo area has changed, and smoke begins to break into the cabin. The first passengers show signs of alarm. Someone coughs. Someone raises his head from the chair, trying to understand the smell that fills the space. The guides are trying to calm people down, but the air is getting thicker. The situation is growing faster than can be explained. Meanwhile, something begins to happen in the cabin that will later become the nightmare of the investigation. The machines, those little black buttons, start popping up one after the other. Every quiet click is a loss of the system. Climate control. The electrical system is on the right side. Separate navigation channels. Part of the lighting. Another block. Click, click, click. It's like a machine made of millions of precise components is slowly starting to die. The co-pilot listens to the instruments shutting down one by one. But he keeps reading the checklist, trying to keep up with what is happening in reality. The captain is constantly in touch with the dispatcher, although the connection is barely holding. 295, go ahead. Short fragments, phrases that make less sense and more despair. The crew needs to land, according to the instructions, at the nearest airfield. It's a reunion, but the captain does not give the command to set course. And there is something in the recording of his voice that will later become a source of endless speculation. No, I have no choice. This phrase will go down in the history of investigations. The decline continues. But while the plane is heading lower, the heat in the cargo area increases so much that something begins that should never happen in flight technology. Metal deformation. The temperature is rising under the floor next to the cargo wall. So fast that the structure begins to lose its density. Metal plays under load, as if alive, but it's not life, it's destruction. At certain moments, the sound of fire becomes audible even in the cabin, not directly, but as a low pressure in the skin, as an unnatural hum, as a barely noticeable vibration. The flight engineer reports a new series of failures. There is less and less light on the panel. Some indicators go out forever. Others are flashing for the last time. The captain tries to turn on the air recirculation mode, hoping to draw in a fresh stream and expel the smoke. But the system is already damaged. She literally starts pumping the same smoke through the cabin, accelerating it even faster. During these seconds, the crew hears coughing in the cabin. This means that the smoke has already made its way here. The co-pilot sits up slightly, trying to see the horizon. But the smoke gets in the way. It hurts my eyes. He blinks, trying to clear his eyes. His hand reaches for the small emergency mask. It gives relief, but the devices still become less distinguishable. The flight engineer peers at his visor. Each new section looks darker. He tries to restore at least some of the circuits, but the fire below creates such unstable conditions that any actions lose their meaning. And at some point, the captain does what the instructions say is a last resort. He asks to open the doors so that fresh air enters the cabin. This action has always been considered controversial, but in theory, it should have helped to ease the conditions. Today, it only accelerates the Gorenge process. Oxygen is the last thing this situation needs right now. The pilots can no longer see the cabin, but they know it's already very hard to breathe there. The dispatcher in Mauritius is trying to call the flight again at this moment. Springbok 295 Mauritius. Springbok 295. Silence. The crew is doing everything possible, but the plane is no longer fully compliant. Altitude readings are jumping. Individual buttons do not respond. The controls are getting tight. And under the feet of the flight engineer there is a barely audible sound, similar to a strange crack. This is how the case heats up. This is how metal behaves, ready to violate its own integrity. And when the temperature reaches a critical point,
something happens that is always considered impossible. The body begins to deform already on the bearing sections. The liner, which is huge and designed to withstand enormous loads, is inferior to the heat it should never have been subjected to. There is a painful tearing sound, not a pop, but a long metallic scream. The pilots don't even have time to figure out what exactly happened. The load is redistributed instantly. The structure above the cargo hold breaks first. The plane breaks down in the air.
Two huge parts of the hull, united a moment ago, begin to fall into the darkness. In the cabin, the instruments go out completely. The noise becomes deafening, and in a matter of seconds, the dark surface of the ocean rises towards them, and from above, there remains only a trace of a fading alarm signal, which disappears as suddenly as the voice of the crew once disappeared from the air. Morning over the Indian Ocean comes slowly. First, the horizon fades, then the water takes on a steely hue, which reflects the first scattered sun. But on this day, dawn does not bring peace, only the awareness of emptiness. There was nothing where the plane should have been, no spots on the water, no oil plume, just a silent surface, as if hiding a secret. Search planes take off even before the sun finally rises above the horizon. They walk in wide arcs, and the pilots peer down, trying to discern at least some trace. And only after many hours, when the eyes are already tired of the endless glare of the ocean, they notice on the surface what they have been looking for so long. Debris. Small pieces of plastic, fragments of interior decoration, several items that could belong to passengers, and the bodies of 8 people found drifting in the water about 200 kilometers from Mauritius. This is the first confirmation. The plane crashed. The fall was severe, and people could hardly have survived even under different circumstances. But there is a detail that immediately catches the attention of experts. Tests show that there are soot and smoke particles in the tissues of the dead. People didn't lose consciousness from the impact. They breathed smoke long before they came into contact with water. This means that the fire was not just local. It covered more than a single section. It spread strongly enough that its effects ended up in the airways of passengers. And this is a reason for serious questions.
But while experts are analyzing the bodies and small debris, the main part of the plane remains somewhere far underwater. And if investigators want to find out what happened, they need to find the black boxes before their beacons go silent. Time is working against them. It took 21 days just to assemble the ship, equipment, and a team of specialists and deliver it all to the presumed crash site. And when the boat with rescuers finally reaches the area where, according to calculations, the plane should be, there is only a week left until the moment when the batteries of the lighthouses will fall silent forever. But the ocean is indifferent to human deadlines. He's silent. A day or two passes. 6. There is nothing on the surface. The locators are silent. No signals rise from the bottom. And now comes the 30th day, the one after which the chance to hear the lighthouse disappears. The day passes, and with it, the hope of an easy answer disappears. And then the investigators have a new idea, the one that should be the salvation. The Zur station, through which all South African aircraft messages pass, was required to record the crew's conversations. If there is an emergency on board long before the last communication session, it should be on the tapes. Investigators are contacting South African Airways with a request. Provide records for the night of the crash. The answer comes quickly, and it's stunning. The tape is destroyed, overwritten. But there is a nuance that makes the situation really strange. The tapes from the day before the tragedy were preserved. The tapes for the day after are also intact. Only the recording of that night was overwritten after 30 days of storage. And there are no copies preserved anywhere. Not a single one. It's too neat a coincidence. It's too convenient. And the most disturbing thing is that this is not the only document that has disappeared.
When the investigators demand to provide the original master waybill, the main cargo document that should accurately record which goods were on board, they are told, the original has been destroyed. He was sent to the shredder immediately after the disaster. But the investigation is given an official copy, paper that was supposed to be an exact reflection of the original. The paper, which is now the only source of truth about the cargo. But how can you trust a copy if the original was destroyed? Especially considering the geopolitical context. Sanctions, conflicts, secret transportation. This causes a real flurry of suspicions. But the investigation is still ongoing. And finally, a few months after the crash, a breakthrough appears. The sonars manage to detect an anomaly, a structure that may be part of the liner. The depth is 4.5 kilometers, much deeper than the Titanic. There is no equipment for this depth. The underwater vehicle needs to be redesigned, strengthened, and equipped with a new camera. And most importantly, we need a new cable. 7 kilometers of optical fiber, which does not exist ready-made. It will have to be specially made. It takes months. But when the underwater vehicle is finally lowered into the darkness of the ocean, it gradually begins to show the first video signal. And through the cloudy suspension, the outlines of what's left of the plane appear on the screen. It's not a solid hull. It's a field of debris scattered over a huge area, a sign that the plane has collapsed in the air. In some parts of the metal, traces of strong heating are noticeable, and somewhere there are traces of deformation, uncharacteristic of hitting water. In one place, fragments of the cargo area are visible, so deformed that it seems as if the metal has melted and solidified again in seawater. 3 wristwatches are among the wreckage. All are stopped at the same time. They record the moment when the remains of the plane touch the bottom.
A year later, they find a speech recorder. But the joy is immediately replaced by disappointment. The record is damaged. Of the entire flight, 80 seconds were saved. Not critical, not key, but fragments in which it is almost impossible to assemble a complete picture. The parametric recorder has not been found so far. He's out there somewhere, 4.5 kilometers underwater. The depth makes it almost inaccessible. But even fragmentary data and individual findings are beginning to add up to an alarming picture. Traces of fire clearly indicate unusually high temperatures. Some elements of the cargo, such as a graphite racket, turned out to be melted, and graphite melts at temperatures that are simply impossible under normal conditions on board an airplane. The investigators are beginning to wonder, what exactly was on fire in the cargo section? Sports equipment is not. Medical equipment is not. Electronics are not either. The official list does not explain the nature of this heat. And then independent researchers find something that reverses the course of the investigation. Traces of a chemical known as ammonium perchlorate, the main component of rocket fuel. There was no such substance in any cargo document. It was not included in the list of approved items. It couldn't have ended up in the cargo hold of a regular flight. But it was there. Traces were found on fragments of the skin. And now it becomes clear that what happened may have much deeper roots than just an emergency. The South African government is beginning to put pressure on the Commission to complete the investigation, cut costs, and stop dragging the process out. It looks weird. It's too weird considering there were civilian passengers on board. But one more detail remains a mystery, which appeared on the few remaining seconds of recording from the voice recorder. When the co-pilot says for the first time that he sees smoke, the captain responds, "This can't be happening," a phrase that sounds not like surprise but like denial, as if he already knew that smoke might appear, but wanted to believe that it would not happen after all. When the flight engineer suggests boarding a Reunion, the nearest island, the captain responds, "No, I cannot." These words leave the feeling that the decision was made in advance, not in the cockpit, not by the crew, but by someone before departure. And the last oddity is the reaction of the airline's chief pilot. He was woken up in the middle of the night. They said only one thing: "We lost the plane." No flight number, no details, no flight name. And he immediately said, "This is the Helderberg." Why was he so sure? The investigation is nearing completion, but there is still no response. The Commission cannot officially confirm the smugging or unauthorized cargo, but it is also impossible to refute it. Too many documents have disappeared. Too many traces were erased. Too much has not been preserved. However, one thing is becoming clear. The disaster was not a simple accident. Its roots are in politics, in international restrictions, in secrets, and probably in an attempt to hide the truth about what the Helderberg was carrying. And all these are shadows that will remain over this story for many decades to come. The following months of the investigation seem to pass under a heavy dome of silence. Officials are making statements, the press is looking for versions, families are waiting for answers, but no one can say what exactly happened in the depths of the cargo hold, where the fire that destroyed the plane started. Sometimes the shadows of truth live longer than the facts, and the case of Helderberg is exactly like that. Even when the Commission summarizes the results, there is no hard point in their report. There is no one explanation that would put everything in its place. There is only one conclusion. A fire in the cargo area led to the destruction of the structure and the loss of the aircraft. But behind this formulation lies the space of a whole universe of questions. Why was the original cargo document destroyed? Why did the recordings of the station Zur disappear, and only on the night of the tragedy? Why did the captain talk about the bomb, about forged documents, that there is no choice? Why is there a trace of a substance used in rocket fuel found on the fragments? None of these questions receive an official answer. But it's the lack of answers that makes the story so disturbing. Fires on board airplanes are studied, repeated in simulators, analyzed down to the smallest detail. But a fire, the temperature of which is capable of melting graphite and deforming the liner structure while still in the air, is another category. A category that requires you to know what exactly was burning. And here the investigation runs into a wall, which could hide not only a mistake or an accident, but also a political decision. The Helderberg was not just a flight. In research materials, this is felt between the lines. It was an airplane that could have things on board that were not intended for the eyes of outsiders. The sanctioned country is looking for ways to obtain the equipment. Other countries are helping. The papers are being cleaned. The routes are planned over the ocean, away from prying eyes. And when something goes wrong, the tragedy becomes more than just the loss of people. She becomes a threat of exposure. States that live surrounded by prohibitions and pressure sometimes build a hierarchy of secrecy higher than security. And in this hierarchy, the captain of a civilian aircraft is just a performer. That is why the phrase "I can't" sounds so unusual for a person who has to make decisions for the sake of saving lives, and not for the sake of hidden directives. Perhaps he wanted to land the plane on the nearest island. Perhaps he saw the only safe option.
But another factor was important to him, one that the crew only found out about that night when the plane was already in the air. And this factor has become stronger than common sense. But one thing has changed thanks to this tragedy. When the investigation announced the interim conclusions, it became clear that the security system, which is trusted by millions of people, needs to be reviewed, especially the fire protection system for cargo compartments. Prior to this incident, Class B compartments, such as on the Helderberg, did not require an automatic extinguishing system. It was believed that the crew could access the fire at any time and handle it manually. Reality has shown that this is a dangerous illusion. After the investigation, the international aviation regulations were revised. Now such compartments are required to have automatic extinguishing, sealing, and fire prevention systems. No crew should ever enter the cargo hold with a handheld fire extinguisher in an attempt to stop a flame that may be stronger than the aircraft's design allows. The procedure for processing cargo documents has also been revised. Now, each position must be reflected clearly, correctly, and verifiable. It has become much more difficult to manipulate cargo papers. The cost of mistakes and hidden operations has turned out to be too expensive. These measures were created thanks to the people who were on board the Helderberg. These measures appeared because one November dawn, small pieces of plastic, fabric, and human tragedy surfaced over the Indian Ocean, which made the whole world think. Today, the wreckage of the plane is still lying at the bottom. Fragments of metal bent by fire, the clock that froze at the moment of impact, and dozens of tons of silent testimony. And with them are questions that no one will ever give an official answer to.
What exactly was taken south? Why was it hidden? And would there have been a chance for the crew if the first signs of fire had been noticed earlier, or if they had been allowed to act differently? These questions will come back over and over again. Whenever someone looks at the map of that flight and sees that thin line that stretches over the inky waters of the Indian Ocean. The story of the Helderberg is not just about disaster. This is a story about trust that can be destroyed in an instant, about decisions that are made behind closed doors, far from the eyes of those who will bear the consequences, about the people who fought to the last in the cockpit, in total darkness, when the instruments went out one by one. About how sometimes the most important answers are hidden deeper than a person can dive. But it's also a story about how even an invisible tragedy can change the world. Because aviation became safer after Helderberg. Because someone's life will now be saved thanks to what once happened in the cargo hold of one overnight flight. And perhaps this is the only thing that can be learned from the silence that still surrounds this story. A silence in which one hears respect for those who were on board, and the memory of those last words that were heard on the air. We have a smoke problem in the airplane.
a phrase that will forever remain a symbol of the flight that disappeared into the night. Today, decades later, when this story is talked about in aviation schools or in the archives of investigative agencies, one feeling invariably remains, as if something in it has remained unsaid. It's as if there's a space at its very core that no one can fill with facts or formal conclusions. Disaster movies always have a denouement. The moment when it becomes clear, here is the reason, here is the chain of errors, here is the point where everything went wrong. But real life sometimes leaves gaps that don't close even after generations. And Helderberg is just such a story. When you look at its route, at that long arc over the ocean, you realize how strange and lonely the fate of this plane was. He flew over the water most of the way, probably intentionally, perhaps because it was impossible otherwise. But in the end, it was this isolation that became his destiny. No one saw the fire. No one could come to the rescue. No one could hear the last words of the crew, except for one dispatcher on the island, who repeated in vain, "Springbok 295, do you copy?" And each time the silence became heavier. The silence in which hopes die. There are still questions. There are many of them. Why did the captain receive a document that he did not show to the crew? Why didn't the replacement crew know anything? Why did the route take the plane along a line that seemed to avoid all possible airfields? Why did the same chief pilot guess the aircraft in question? Why did traces of rocket fuel end up where they don't belong? Why were the main documents destroyed immediately after the disaster? Each of these questions is like a small crack in a huge concrete wall. It cannot be destroyed. But a faint light enters the room through it, hinting that something is hidden behind the wall. And the truth is a stubborn thing. It always comes up in detail, in unnaturally high temperatures, in molten graphite. The pressure that shouldn't have changed, but it did. In the words, "No, I have no choice." Sometimes tragedies are not just mistakes. Sometimes tragedies are the result of decisions that no one should have known about. But if you put aside everything around you, politics, rumors, theories, guesses, the main thing remains. People, the crew, who fought for control until the last moment, while one by one the instruments failed. The flight attendants who went to the door of the cargo hold, knowing that there could be a fire behind it. Passengers who will never know what exactly caused the smoke that began to fill the cabin in those last minutes. The dispatcher who was trying to get on the air, holding on to the hope that he would be answered in the next moment. It's easy to lose the human scale in the story of Helderberg because there's a mystery all around. But it's this human scale that makes it so difficult. Because behind every second, behind every click of the machine, behind every word on the air, there are real destinies. What happened on board was not just a disaster. It was a struggle that was waged in conditions when the plane was almost beyond control, when every breath in the cabin was filled with smoke, when the pilot's eyes hurt and the instruments went out one by one, and when, somewhere outside the cabin door, people were holding onto the armrests, hoping that the crew would lead them back to the ground. In the final, there are 2 hits on the water, so fast that no one had time to figure out what was going on. And then silence. The very silence that lasts until today. But even if we never know the whole truth, something else is important. The story of Helderberg has changed the rules, changed the procedures, changed approaches. Hundreds of planes are now flying safer. due to the conclusions that were drawn after this tragedy. Aviation has become tougher to inspections, stricter to documents, more attentive to cargo. Every cargo bay is now required to have systems that didn't exist back then. Every crew is now protected by something that wasn't even thought of before. It won't bring back life, but it gives those who fly today a chance to sleep peacefully on night flights, even if the window is just as dark over the ocean. And when future pilots are told about Flight 295 in training centers, they are not only talking about the firefighting procedure, not only about the structure of cargo compartments, not just about documents. They are told about the people in the cockpit who did not give up, about the captain who fought to the last, about the team that was trying to keep control despite the smoke and thuds somewhere below. And somewhere at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, in the midst of the cold darkness, fragments of the Helderberg still lie. And each of them is a reminder that the truth may be deeper than a person can reach, but memory is always closer. It rises to the surface every time someone looks at the empty sky at night and hears in their head the words transmitted from back in 1987. We have a smoke problem in the airplane. And this phrase lives on, like the quiet voice of those who flew over the ocean at night, and as a warning to the whole world about the price of secrecy, about the fragility of life, and that sometimes silence speaks louder than any answers. Sometimes stories don't end where the facts end. Real stories live on, in memories, in consequences, in those small details that continue to accompany people long after the tragedy. And Helderberg is one of those stories. After the disaster, commemorative events were held on the coast of South Africa for a long time. Families gathered together, looked at each other, sometimes in silence, sometimes through tears. No one could explain why everything happened the way it did, why the flight, which was supposed to be an ordinary overnight flight, became a mystery that has grown into a legend that is still being discussed by pilots, engineers, and aviation historians. They say that time heals, but there are events from which time does not heal. It only teaches you to live with them. For many people, this flight was not a tragedy, but a story that cannot be let go. Aviation museums have small corners where there are photographs of passengers, fragments of recovered luggage, and pieces of metal recovered from the ocean floor. At first glance, they're just objects, but everyone has their own past, their own path, which was interrupted that night. These exhibits remain silent, but there is great power in this silence. Sometimes researchers return to the materials on Helderberg, although many years have passed. They are reviewing photographs of the wreckage, rereading fragments of reports, comparing details that seem to have been studied for a long time. And every time they get the feeling that there is something else in this story, that there is more between the lines than is written in the documents. Catching the truth is like trying to pull light from the depths of the ocean. It either crumbles into pieces or is lost in the water column. But the search continues, not for the sake of sensation, but for the sake of understanding. Because every such tragedy is a bridge to making the sky safer. And when experts gather at conferences and discuss the causes of old accidents, Flight 295 is almost always mentioned. Not as a case where there is an accurate conclusion, but as an example of the fact that a fire on board is one of the most insidious threats to civil aviation. The reconstruction footage shows the same containers, partitions, and gray panels. You can see how a tiny flame can turn into an uncontrollable flow of heat in a matter of minutes. It can be seen why automatic extinguishing systems are now mandatory. And it becomes clear, the lives of those on board have not disappeared without a trace. She became part of a huge chain of changes. Memory is also a kind of security system. But there is another layer of this story, the quietest one. One that is rarely talked about in reports or documentaries, but which is felt by everyone who has studied this tragedy. It's a feeling of incompleteness, as if somewhere in the depths, among the cold currents and debris, lies not only metal, but also the unsaid truth. And even if no one ever brings it to the surface, it still exists. She became part of the ocean, part of history, part of the memory of those who lost loved ones. And part of this truth is in every person who gets on a plane today and believes that technology can protect. Because it is precisely such tragedies that have forced the world to reconsider how airplanes work, how cargo is transported, and what rules apply at altitude. Because every flight now has a small part of those lessons that were paid too high a price. At the end of every documentary, there comes a moment when the camera rises above the ocean. The water below is calm, no footprints, only light ripples, a silence that nothing disturbs. But if you listen carefully, this silence has its own memory. She remembers that one night a huge liner disappeared here. She remembers the voices of the passengers, those who slept in the chairs. He remembers the crew who fought in the last minutes, remembers the last words broadcast, and that barely perceptible moment when everything stopped. And then, many years of searching for answers. And today, when you look at this point on the world map in the middle of the emptiness of the Indian Ocean, it seems that there is nothing special about it. But if you know the history, then this place will never be just a coordinate anymore. This is the point where life stopped and questions remained. This is the point where reality and mystery merge into one line. But memory is what allows you to put a final point where there are not enough facts. And it is not put in words, but in silence. The one that was on the air when the dispatcher kept saying, "Springbok 295, do you copy?" And he was waiting for an answer. The answer that never came. But the story they left behind still resounds today. Quietly, carefully, with respect to those who were on board, and with a reminder to all of us, there are no small things in aviation. And every saved future has already been paid for in the past.